Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going back to 13th century India.
Ooh, exciting.
It is. This is when the Delhi Sultanate came to power.
Okay.
And we're going to be looking at how they transformed Indian society.
Interesting.
Yeah. It wasn't just conquering land. They really changed the culture.
Yeah, that's what's so fascinating about this period.
Yes.
It really challenges how we think about conquests, right?
Right.
The Delhi Sultanate, it wasn't just about military power. It was really about new ideas.
New systems, new ideas, yeah.
And how those ideas spread through the culture.
It's like
Yeah.
dropping a rock in a pond, you know?
Exactly. The ripples, they just keep going.
Yeah, and that's what we're looking at. We're going beyond, like the battles and the wars.
Right.
And focusing on how daily life changed for millions of people.
Exactly. And what's really amazing is that we can still see the Sultanate's influence today.
Oh, absolutely.
In India, from the languages they speak.
The languages, yeah.
The buildings. The buildings, yeah.
Okay, so imagine India before the Sultanate. It was like different kingdoms and rulers, all these diverse traditions. And then the sultans arrive.
Right.
And they're like, we got a whole new vision for how this is going to work.
Yeah. And it was a big change. Like, they were completely changing the system, an entire society. They introduced, provinces and districts, officials, like a whole new bureaucracy.
It's like, whoa, system upgrade.
Yeah, exactly.
And it wasn't just about paperwork and title.
No. It changed how people interacted with power.
With the government, yes.
Their expectations of the government, even their own identity within this huge empire.
Right, yeah.
It's a big deal,
It's way beyond just, administration stuff.
Right. It changed the entire power dynamic.
Of the whole region.
Of the whole region. And what's really interesting? It wasn't just, a rigid one-size-fits-all approach.
Wasn't it Akbar who was known for being flexible? I was reading about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Akbar was really pragmatic, He was like, hey, let's incorporate local lords into the administration.
Oh, smart.
Yeah.
Because they already had influence and they already knew the area.
Exactly. He recognized that,
Okay, that's smart.
It was a really good way to manage such a diverse, huge territory.
So he was adapting to his environment.
Exactly.
Now, speaking of changes, let's talk about language.
Okay.
So the Sultanate brought with them Persian.
Okay.
Which became the main language for administration and the elite.
Right.
Can you imagine that?
Yeah, it's similar to how English is a global language now, right?
Business, yeah.
For business, yeah. It's like a common language, makes it easier to communicate and to trade. But imagine this happening centuries ago.
Yeah.
And this spread of Persian had such a big impact, across society.
Wow. I mean, that must have a huge effect on, everything.
Oh, yeah.
From official documents to just, everyday talk.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about the other languages? Do they just disappear?
No, not at all. What happened is you got this really cool mix.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So a lot of Indian languages, they adopted Persian words.
Oh, cool.
So you get this this hybrid way of talking.
No, it's like a fusion. It's not just a replacement.
Exactly. It's a reflection of how cultures were mixing at the time.
That reminds me of how English has absorbed words from other languages.
Yeah.
Over the years.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's wild how language is constantly evolving.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about words. New ideas and concepts were coming into India, too.
Right, yeah.
Which brings us to another area where the Sultanate had a big, long-lasting impact. Education.
Yeah. So with the Sultanate, we get madrassas.
Yes.
Which are Islamic religious schools.
Exactly.
And that's so different from the traditional Indian systems.
Right.
They were more focused on Hindu scriptures and philosophies.
Right.
So this is a whole new path for education.
It is, yeah. And in the madrasas, they taught Islamic law.
Islamic law.
Yeah, theology, and of course, the Persian language.
The Persian language, yeah.
So now you have this new group of religious scholars and administrators who are really important for the Sultanate.
And it makes you wonder how people reacted to this new system.
Right.
Was there pushback from people who liked the traditional ways better?
There were definitely some tensions and adjustments as these different systems kind of bumped up against each other.
Yeah, it must have been a pretty interesting time.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah, and remember, the Sultanate didn't just change these big systems of power and knowledge, It also changed everyday life.
Yeah, like their clothes, their food.
Exactly. It affected how they lived, how they dressed, even what they ate.
Okay, so let's talk about those everyday changes.
Okay.
Can you give us a specific example of how the Sultanate changed daily life?
Well, think about food. That's always a delicious example of cultural exchange, right?
Yeah, food is always good.
Yeah. So the Sultanate, they introduced new ingredients,
Oh.
new ways of cooking, new dishes, and they all mixed with the existing Indian food.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine the smells and flavors in the marketplaces?
I can almost smell it now.
There's a real cultural fusion happening.
Yeah, it wasn't just food, though, right? Like their clothing, social customs.
Oh, absolutely. Like, we see the introduction of new clothes with influences from Central Asia.
Oh, cool.
And it's not just about fashion, you know?
Okay.
These changes in clothing often showed changes in social hierarchies.
Oh, interesting.
And values. Clothes became a way to show your social status.
Oh, wow.
Your religion.
Yeah.
And even how open you were to these new influences.
So, like, what you wore could say a lot about who you were and where you fit in.
Exactly. Clothes were like a visual language.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Oh.
And, you know, not everyone was happy about all these changes.
Oh, of course.
Some people really held on to their old customs and beliefs, while others, you know, they adapted, they mixed the old with the new.
I bet that must have been a really dynamic and sometimes, like, crazy time.
Oh, it was.
With everyone figuring out how to live with these new rules.
Yeah. And all of this, you know, you can see it reflected in the architecture of that time.
Yeah.
Which is what we'll talk about next. The Sultanate had this unique style that mixed Islamic and Indian elements in such amazing ways.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of some of those buildings.
Oh, yeah.
They're incredible. It's like you could see that cultural fusion.
Exactly. And these buildings, they weren't just pretty.
Yeah.
They were powerful symbols. They showed the Sultanate's power.
Yeah.
And they showed how cultures were mixing.
Okay. And that's where we'll pick up next time.
Sounds good.
We'll be looking at those amazing buildings and what they tell us about this period in Indian history.
That's going to be interesting.
Yeah, it's going to be good.
Looking forward to it.
Me too. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're picking up right where we left off, talking about the amazing architecture of the Delhi Sultanate.
Yeah, the architecture is just so captivating. And it wasn't just about building stuff. They were trying to make a statement. Like, show off their power, you know?
Okay, so give us some examples. What buildings really show that mix of styles?
Well, there's the Qutb Minar in Delhi. It's this huge minaret.
Oh, yeah, I've seen pictures.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's got these beautiful Islamic calligraphy details.
Right.
But it also uses traditional Indian design elements. It's a real visual representation of how cultures were blending.
Yeah, it's like this huge monument to change. Are there any other examples you can think of?
Oh, yeah. There's also the tomb of Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq, also in Delhi. It's got this big dome, which is classic Islamic style.
Right.
But it's surrounded by these smaller structures that look a lot like Hindu temples.
Oh, wow.
It's like they were saying, we're here to stay, and we're going to make something totally new by combining the best of both worlds. It's really cool. But what about everyday life? You know, beyond these grand structures, we talked about food and clothes, but what about like social customs? The nitty-gritty details of how people lived.
Oh, the Sultanate, it really affected every level of society, even like the most basic things. Think about clothes, for example.
Okay.
We start to see people wearing Central Asian styles, like long tunics and trousers.
Oh, it's interesting.
But they combine those with existing Indian clothes, so you get these like hybrid garments, really reflected the changing culture.
It's like a fashion fusion show happening over centuries.
Exactly. And it's not just about looking good. The way people dressed, it started to reflect changes in social status and values. Like your clothes could show what your status was, your religion, even how open you were to these new ideas.
So your outfit could say a lot about who you were and where you fit in.
Totally. It was like a whole visual language.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Yeah. And keep in mind, not everyone was excited about these changes. Some people really wanted to hold on to their old ways, while others were like, okay, let's adapt. Let's mix the old and the new.
Yeah. It must have been a crazy time with everyone trying to figure out how to live with all these changes.
It was a really dynamic period, for sure. And a big question is, what made people react in different ways?
Right. Like, why did some embrace it and some resist?
That's a tough question. There's no easy answer. I mean, it depended on your social status, your religion, where you lived, your own experiences. For some people, the Sultanate brought opportunities, you know?
Okay.
While for others, it was disruptive. They lost their old ways of life.
So everyone had their own story.
Exactly. And those individual stories are what make history so interesting. You see the real human impact of these big events.
Yeah, it's not just names and dates. It's real people's lives.
Exactly. And, you know, it's easy to focus on the positive side of cultural exchange.
The cool buildings, the new foods.
Yeah. But there were challenges, too.
Oh, definitely.
Like, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. Did everyone benefit equally from these changes? No way.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. While some groups did great under the Sultanate, others were pushed to the margins of society.
Can you give us an example?
Well, think about those local rulers we talked about earlier. Some of them, they lost power because of the Sultanate's new system.
Oh, so their authority was weakened.
Yeah, exactly. You had this clash between the old ways and the new centralized system. And of course, religion played a role too. I mean, the Sultanate was Islamic,
Yeah.
and they brought with them a whole different worldview.
Okay.
Now, there were times when things were pretty tolerant
Okay.
and cultures mixed freely. But there were also times when there was persecution and temples were destroyed.
So even with all the beautiful architecture and mixed clothing styles, religion could still cause conflict.
Unfortunately, yes. It's a reminder that cultural exchange doesn't just magically make religious differences disappear.
Huh.
Sometimes those differences can cause real tension and violence.
It's important to remember that. Yeah, it's like we need to see the whole picture, both the good and the bad.
Absolutely. Acknowledging the negative stuff doesn't erase the Sultanate's achievements. It just gives us a more complete understanding of their legacy.
A more nuanced view, yeah.
Exactly. And it's those complexities we're going to be exploring next. We'll look at how different groups experience these changes and what the Sultanate's lasting impact really was on India.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been talking about how the Delhi Sultanate changed Indian society. And now I want to get into how different groups experience those changes.
Yeah, good point. It's not like everyone had the same experience, right?
Right. So let's start with the people who may have benefited. Who were they? How did their lives change?
Well, merchants and traders, especially those doing long-distance trade, they often did pretty well.
Okay.
You know, the Sultanate brought stability and security, which is good for business.
Makes sense.
And they opened up new trade routes, so India was connected to more of the world.
So it's like the Sultanate created a good environment for business to grow.
Exactly. What about artisans and craftsmen? What do you think happened to them?
I'm guessing they probably benefited too, right?
You got it. The Sultanate was big on art and architecture.
Yeah, we were just talking about that.
Right. So naturally, there was more demand for skilled artisans.
Okay.
And you see some incredible stuff from this period. Beautiful metalwork, textiles, ceramics, really shows how creative Indian artisans were.
It sounds like there was a real artistic boom happening.
Yeah, for sure. But like we said before, not everyone had it so good.
Right. Who faced the most challenges during this time?
Well, remember those local rulers we talked about?
Yeah, the ones who lost some of their power?
Exactly. The Sultanate system really undermined their authority.
So it was like the old ways versus the new system.
Yeah, you could say that. And for some religious communities, things were tough.
Like who?
Well, especially Hindus, they had a hard time sometimes because of their religion.
Okay.
There were times when things were okay, but there's also persecution and temples being destroyed.
Yeah, it's sad, but it's true. Even when you have cultural exchange, religious differences can lead to conflict.
It's a good reminder that things aren't always simple, you know?
Absolutely. It seems like the Sultanate left behind a really complicated legacy with good and bad parts.
That's a great way to put it. And that's what makes it so fascinating to study.
Yeah.
It's not about saying who were the good guys and bad guys. It's about understanding the nuances.
The complexities.
Yeah. There were people who did well and people who suffered. There were times of progress and times of hardship.
Okay.
And all those stories, they all contribute to the Sultanate's legacy.
So how should we think about this legacy today? I mean, we're living centuries later.
That's a big question. I think one thing we can learn is how connected everything is.
Connected.
Yeah, like politics, society, culture, they all influence each other.
Okay.
The Delhi Sultanate wasn't just about politics. They reshaped everything in Indian society.
From language to how people live their daily lives.
Exactly. So it shows us that even events from long ago can still affect us today.
It's like history is still relevant.
Totally. And I think it's also important to remember how resilient people were back then.
Okay.
They went through a lot of upheaval, but they still kept their traditions alive.
Right.
And they blended those traditions with the new influences. That's how they created this vibrant, diverse culture that's still around today.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is, and I think it's a message that's really relevant now, you know? We're living in a time of constant change, too.
Yeah, that's true.
So seeing how people adapted back then can be inspiring.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up our deep dive.
Yeah.
It's been awesome exploring the Delhi Sultanate with you.
It has been. It's such a fascinating topic.
I hope our listeners learned something new about this really important period in Indian history.
Me too.
And to our listeners, Keep exploring. There's so much more to discover about the Delhi Sultanate.
Absolutely. And there are so many other chapters of history out there waiting to be explored.
Yeah, so keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.